When it comes to the Middle Ages in Europe, do you associate it with kings who didn't bathe? Streets full of feces. Indulgences squeezing the people. 100,000 witches burned at the stake. Under the influence of numerous influencers, the Middle Ages in Europe has become a paradise for barbarians. Even many humanists and popular science influencers are upholding the narrative of the Dark Middle Ages. In fact, this assessment does not align with the true history. We generally have a serious misunderstanding of the Middle Ages in Europe. Today, we will take a few minutes to briefly analyze the errors in this historical perspective. First, we need to establish a clear historical boundary for the Middle Ages in Europe. Usually, we consider the Middle Ages beginning with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, and ending with the onset of the Renaissance in the 15th century. In general, we have a serious misunderstanding. Today, we will take a few minutes to briefly analyze the errors in this historical perspective. Next, we can start with population and economy. Education, culture, and religion are the 5 basic aspects to objectively evaluate. To make an objective judgment whether this historical assessment of the Dark Middle Ages is valid. First is the population. In the entire history of human civilization, before the Industrial Revolution, influenced by infant mortality rates, population growth has been very slow. So when measuring history before the Industrial Revolution, we need to pay attention to the population size as the primary indicator. We can see that, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, all the way until the year 600 AD, during this period, the population continued to decrease. But from 600 AD onwards, the population began to gradually increase. By the year 1200, the population started to grow rapidly again, until the outbreak of the Black Death in 1300. Then it started to decrease continuously. After 1400, it began to gradually rise again. Overall, during the medieval period in Europe, the population of Europe showed an upward trend. If it really is as some marketing accounts depict, the Middle Ages were a time of superstition and darkness, a time when the lower class suffered greatly. Then the birth rate should have continued to decrease. Secondly, in terms of economy, looking at the economic development throughout medieval Europe, although its share in the world economy was not high, but the economic development in medieval Europe was not regressive. The economy does rise with the increase in population, and gradually rises. Thirdly, in terms of education, many people propagate the superstition and darkness of medieval Europe, as if everyone were illiterate. Western European society has always been in a feudal state ruled by barbarians. It's important to note that the term university itself comes from Latin. For example, the departments in our modern universities. The term department itself comes from the Latin word for ability, and our department heads come from the Latin words for chief and officer. Yes, during the Middle Ages in Europe, over 80 universities were established. In the year 1088, the world's oldest university, the University of Bologna, was founded. It is known as the mother of universities. Another aspect is in terms of culture. Many people believe that Europe had only one Renaissance. To be precise, up to now, Europe has already experienced 4 Renaissances. The first one was the Carolingian Renaissance in the year 800 AD. Charlemagne sponsored education and culture, establishing many court schools. He not only cultivated a large number of outstanding scholars and artists, but also preserved many ancient texts that needed to be passed down. For example, Alcuin, who advocated combining faith and knowledge. He directly promoted the Carolingian revival and dissemination of classical culture. Additionally, there was Alcuin, who advocated interpreting faith with reason. He established his theological and philosophical system on logical premises. He constructed his own theological and philosophical system. The second was during the 12th century Renaissance. During this period, many famous universities like Oxford and Cambridge emerged successively. Within the universities, law, the academic disciplines of literature and philosophy also began to gradually establish themselves. During this period, a large number of scholastic scholars inherited the speculative legacy of logic from ancient Greek Aristotle. The speculative legacy of logic also gave birth to scholastic philosophers like Thomas Aquinas. The third is the one we are familiar with, the Italian Renaissance of the 14th to 16th centuries. Humanism began to rise. The value and dignity of human beings were affirmed. The people of this period reached a peak in their love for classical culture. Figures like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael emerged. Shakespeare, and representative figures like Copernicus. The fourth time, which is also the closest to us, occurred in Europe from the mid-19th to the early 20th century. This period saw extensive reforms and progress in European society. Old social systems and values were re-examined by people. Such iconic cultural figures as Hugo, Chopin, Monet, Picasso, and Joyce. These representative cultural figures all emerged during this period. Why is Europe's Middle Ages often perceived as the Dark Ages? In fact, this perception originated from humanist scholars of the Italian Renaissance. Petrarch once extensively criticized the culture of the Middle Ages in the 14th century, along with its education. He believed that the medieval culture of Western Europe was in a state of vulgarity, ignorance, and decline. Compared to the culture of ancient Greece and Rome, it was considered very dark. This historical perspective, with the Enlightenment movement in 18th century Europe, received further dissemination, gradually became the mainstream view in modern European history. Research. Against the historical backdrop at that time, many humanists of the Enlightenment period held strong resentment towards the secular power of the church and religious persecution, harbored strong indignation. Therefore, this view not only reflects the moral judgments of many humanists in a specific historical context, but also carries significant subjective historical biases. The so-called assessment of the Dark Ages is just a one-sided view. These are merely from scholars to emphasize the necessity of the Enlightenment movement and deliberately establish a historical perspective. It can be said that this view is absurd. Fundamentally speaking, this view does not meet the basic standards of historical research. In fact, as early as the beginning of the 20th century, this viewpoint is no longer popular in Western academic circles. But due to the compilation of world history textbooks and the general academic backwardness in world history, many intellectuals still follow the crowd, without any verification, believe and spread such statements. This has directly led to the prevailing notion among people still stuck in the last century. In the so-called marketing jargon, Europeans relieved themselves anywhere for 1,000 years. The claim that they didn't like to bathe is even a laughable rumor. As early as the return of the Crusades, they brought back Roman-style hot baths to Europe. Almost every major city in Europe had a large number of public bathhouses. Even the impoverished population could choose to wash in rivers. The so-called Catholic Church used superstitious beliefs to control people's bathing habits. It also does not align with historical facts. In fact, even Catholic clergy and monks had their own exclusive baths, or cleaned themselves in local public baths. In religious beliefs, they only oppose excessive bathing and indulgence in luxurious bath products. The historical evidence I mentioned above is actually abundant. For example, the French writer Georges Vigarello once detailed the history of bathing, specifically showcasing the bathing habits of Parisians in the 13th century. Europeans not only loved bathing, but also particularly enjoyed steam baths. At that time, kings and nobles had their own luxurious baths. In addition, the marketing accounts often mention the French Sun King Louis XIV, promoting heavily the claim that Louis XIV only bathed 3 times in his lifetime, whereas in historical reality, the Sun King Louis XIV not only loved taking baths, but also had a large bathtub carved out of a single piece of marble that is still kept in the Palace of Versailles to this day. In fact, the so-called Dark Ages are more of a subjective, emotional evaluation, rather than an objective historical fact. We just need to casually flip through a book to discover that these rumors flying around are not true. Strictly speaking, the European Middle Ages were a period of both light and darkness, where barbarism and progress coexisted, filled with changes and unknown challenges. Stay tuned as I take you through a popular look at philosophy. Next time, we will soon enter the Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th century. Let's get to know the famous philosophers of this period together. Friends, see you next time.